It left me high and dry. I've been going through the ringer. I need you in my life. Time seems crazy. I'm stranded in the desert. This life gets so hot, I need a sip of you, God. Cause you're like water when I'm thirsty, yeah. Drink, drink. You're like water when I'm thirsty. Drink, drink. Hey. Ooh. It's warm down here. It's hard to breathe. It's burning my eyes, Lord. So hard to see. I'm quite parched now. I need a savior. Come quench my thirst, Lord. Because you're like water for the thirsty. I drink, I drink. You're like water for the thirsty. I drink, I drink. You're like water for the thirsty. I drink, I drink. Water for the thirsty, yeah. I drink,
it's like water for the thirsty. Truthfully, our souls parched. You will find them when you seek them with your whole heart. It's so hard to stay consistent through the word I'm reading. Cause the time is coming soon when every eye gon' see him in the clouds above. This is about a love that quenches the thirst. What the world offers is not enough. Taste and see from this fountain spring, you'll be lining up to get a drink. Refreshing ink flowing out of cups. This life they gotta touch, you liberate them out of cuffs. Through faith, it's undivided trust, created us up out of dust. He's worthy of fresh well of living water for the thirsty. Give her honor the first thing that I do when I'm waking up. It's everlasting life to all who desire to drink
you're
it up.
like water when I'm thirsty. Drink. You're like water when I'm thirsty. Drink. Like water when I'm thirsty. Drink. You're like water when I'm thirsty. Drink. Hard weekend, it left me high and dry. I've been going through the ringer. I need you in my life. Time seems crazy. I'm stranded in the desert. This life gets so hot, I need a sip of you, God. Cause you're like water when I'm thirsty, yeah. Drink, drink. You're like water when I'm thirsty. Drink, drink. Hey. Ooh. It's warm down here. It's hard to breathe. It's burning my eyes, Lord. So hard to see. I'm quite parched now. I need a savior. Come quench my thirst, Lord. Because you're like water for the thirsty. I drink, I drink. You're like water for the thirsty. I drink, I drink. You're like water for the thirsty. I drink, I drink. Water for the thirsty, yeah. I drink,
It's like water for the thirsty.
You saw them dig it up?
Hey, man, everybody.
Hey, hey.
Good to see you guys. It's good
Uh,
to good. I missed you all. It's been too long. Having 5 Fridays in a month keeps us away for longer than it needs to be. Everybody good? Ron, what up,
Good,
man?
man. Good.
That's a
Yep.
nice blue. That's a nice blue you have on there, man. Like you got the memo today and the others didn't.
That's right. It's water, man.
Yeah,
It's
they
water.
didn't read the email. Oh, man, it's good to see you all. It's good to be able to dialogue today a little bit about the word. We have a big a big swath to pick from because since the last time we met in the 3 or 4 weeks since it's been, we covered First and Second Corinthians. We started Mark, we ended Joshua, we finished Judges, Ruth, and we were in for Samuel. And of course, Psalms are so long that we're still reading that. So
Yeah, can't read. We're still reading Psalms, man.
Yeah. I did one a few weeks ago.
so
149 more to go.
there's a lot that's
one a year.
You plan to live a long time, bro.
I'm a fall short, dog.
All right. So today we have Courtney, Lauren, Avani, Krana, Marcella, Z, and Kenrick. Kenrick, I'm putting you on the spot a little bit.
Yo,
Did you have anything you thought was interesting out of the readings today?
really?
Yeah, I'm asking you, and here's why I'm asking you. Because our girl Z has a cue that we consider. However,
That was right on cue.
Mhm.
Her whole life, all her life went out.
and I wanted, because of how wide and broad and deep her cue is, I wanted to make sure I gave space to anyone else, and you're the only person I haven't asked. Yeah.
Interesting you ask. So listen. So I'm gonna go back to go back to First Corinthians, which is I guess a while back. But it's something that I've been asking myself and trying to understand since I read it. And it's something that we've talked about, I believe, but I'm not sure I've ever landed in a particular place on it. And so it's First Corinthians, it goes back to 14. So there are denominations and churches who do not believe in the speaking in tongues.
Mhm.
And I've always I was raised a certain way. But the last few times I've read this, I'm like, the way I was raised doesn't really jive with what I'm reading. And I kind of wanted to put it out to the group to kind of understand is there anything I'm missing? And so I guess the idea is that.
How were you raised, Henrik?
Huh?
How were you raised?
I was raised to believe if you spoke in tongues, that it was a foreign language, but a language that other people spoke, like Spanish or Ebonics or some other official language, right? This, however, when you're touched by the Holy Ghost and you say things that have a lot of L's and B's in it, like multiple L's and B's, it is assumed that it is assumed that is in some denominations that is not speaking in tongues, right? And how I was always taught is that it's not speaking in tongues because no one else can understand it, right? But that's not, so as I've read, that's not kind of what I get here. I hear what I'm reading here in 1 Corinthians 14 is that there is this heavenly language or this language that is between you and God that no one else may understand. And it is okay, so there's nothing wrong with the speaking in tongues from that perspective. What I get from this as I read it is that it is encouraged. Is Chris here? Is best practice that that you don't do that unless someone is there to interpret when you're amongst other people, simply because you are trying to I don't want to use the word cater. How did they put it in here? You are anyway, you're trying to help other people in the church, right? And you don't want to be a hindrance. So if there's something that you're saying, someone else may be blessed by what you're saying, so they should understand what it is. So you either say it, in the language where everybody else understands it, or there should be someone there to interpret it. But that is only like a best practice and encouraged in order for, to maintain like the relationships and like just maintaining the church, right? And so that's vastly different than how I was raised in a particular denomination. So I kind of wanted to kind of get people's thoughts here.
So my first question is, where did you get the heavenly tongue?
Just whatever version I was reading. NLT, this one. So I'm in, what's this one I pulled? The Message Bible says a prayer language. I'm on my phone, so I can't pull it up on there. But in multiple versions, there was another version that said like heavenly tongues or whatever.
Yeah, I was just trying to see what verse that was so we could look at it.
All right, so 14, 1 Corinthians 14, and I guess it starts, the Message Bible combines verses. So let's take it 2 and 3. So the first verse says, go after a life of love as if your life depended on it, because it does. Give yourselves to the gifts of God. Give yourself to the gifts God gives you. Most of all, try to proclaim his truth. If you praise him in the private language of tongues, God understands you, but no one else does, for you are sharing intimacies just between you and him. But when you proclaim his truth in everyday speech, you're letting others in on the truth so that they can grow and be strong and experience the presence with you. It goes on that. And this is Message, so it's kind of,
Okay. Yeah. Anybody had any thoughts on that?
So
that was exactly my thought.
I got thoughts, but I can't. I'm like 6 to 1, half a dozen on the other, because there may be some. I think when we came and started studying with Adventists, we'd come from the denomination, I guess, if you will, that believed that there was a prayer language that wasn't spoken here on earth, and it did sound like gibberish. And hearing what some of the Adventist teachers had taught, I'm like, oh, okay, well, yeah, that kind of makes sense. It was sort of what you were saying there, Kendrick, that it was at that time a foreign language, and they just didn't have people who could interpret that. So yeah, there was no point in doing it. It was still a language that was here on earth. So it's like speaking Spanish to people who were Aramaic in that region. So they didn't know what they were saying, or speaking French to someone who's American, if you will. They don't know. But I still couldn't look past this, and then in Corinthians, where Paul talks about the Spirit making utterances which no one can understand.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I mean,
what verse is that, Ron? That's what I'm looking for.
That is Romans. Give me a minute. I think that's Romans 8 or 9. I'll find it, and then I'll let you know. I'll let someone else go ahead.
And I guess what what causes me a lot of pause here is that, like many other things, when we're talking about the differences between various denominations and whatnot, like if you're in a particular denomination, no matter what it is, if there's someone that's doing something different that's contrary to what you believe or what you believe the word is saying, then there carries judgment. There's judgment associated with that. And I guess that's where, when I read this, and I kind of was exposed to certain judgments, and now when I'm reading this, I'm like, hold on, like I don't know, I don't know if those things are 100% fair,
Romans 8.
and how certain people are characterized when they do particular things. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Based upon what the word is saying.
I agree. I guess piggybacking off of what Ron said, yeah, the church I grew up in was heavy into speaking in tongues.
Mm-hmm.
And there were times when it's like, okay, people are just speaking in tongues and speak in tongues. And then there were people would come up and speak in tongues, and then there would be someone to interpret it. And like Ron said, it wasn't until we started studying with you guys that I even heard the concept of, it being an actual foreign language. And
Mm-hmm.
and not. So I think even to this day, I still do. And I think the Bible has enough to show that, like you said, it's not any one thing. I guess in my head, if you look at certain scriptures, you look at others, it's not either or. There's specifics. Obviously, speaking in tongues if you're speaking in tongues in public, and there's a difference speaking in tongue in private. In public,
Correct.
it must be done with an interpreter.
Mm-hmm.
In private, it's between you and God. So and that's just what I pull from the various passages.
And that's what I understood it to be. That's what you just said is how I understood it. What the Bible was, or specifically Paul was stating.
I've got a story I'll share at the risk of sounding like a crazy person, but we'll just move on and see where the consensus of the group is before I.
No, we like crazy. Go ahead.
Anybody else had any other thoughts?
Yeah.
So I have a question, Kenneth.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Why does it matter to you? Do you have a why?
Oh, the judge. It was the assumption that someone is wrong or misinterpreting scriptures.
Okay.
And what they're doing isn't real.
Okay.
And so it was that concern. That's the reason why it stood out to me over the past 2 or 3 times I've read it. It's just from that perspective. That was it.
So I'm gonna say I over the last probably couple of years, I've come to the state of mind where I feel as if I don't know, and it's okay to not know. It's very possible that what they're doing, in my experience, I have never spoken in tongues. That's not my spiritual gift. But I'm sure someone else could look at my spiritual gift and say, oh, that's not a valid gift. That's blasphemy. And so I think I don't know. It could be okay. I don't know. I think my understanding has been shaped by American Adventism, and that sometimes can be very small-minded thinking. So I don't know.
So I'm the same too. I think I would say I don't know either, but I have been guilty of making not necessarily judgments about the person of it being right or wrong, but more about, is it genuine? Is it real? Because I see a lot of people, whether they feel like they have to because of the environment they're in, or people make fun, make jokes and say stuff, or you see it so often and so frequent that it kind of feel like it loses its whatever it's supposed to have. I feel like it loses whatever that is because it's like overdone and over whatever. So it's just like, okay. So you're singing and you just, okay, all right.
So Bruce Wayne on YouTube said,
You saying Batman?
What?
Actually, his sign-on name, Batman the Light Knight.
Batman said it's a learned behavior, but I also feel like leading praise and worship. So I believe my spiritual gift is leading praise and worship. That is a very much so a learned behavior. I have learned how to lead praise and worship by watching other successful worship leaders lead. And I'm not saying that my gift operates exactly how theirs operate, but I've learned how to be effective in my gift by learning their behaviors.
I think this is where I will come in and say language is a funny thing, and understanding comes from the use of language, and words mean different things in context. One example is there was a time when the word gay meant happy, and so someone saying I'm gay would simply mean they're in good spirits. Today that means something completely different, even though it's the same word. I think one of the challenges that we're facing with this is the reading of this in the English Bible. It consistently is translated as tongue, but the word there, I don't know if I can share my screen. Can I? I don't know. I'm on the other computer anyway. It's if you go to King James Bible Dictionary and just type in 1 Corinthians 14:2 and then click on the word for tongue there literally means a language or dialect used by a particular people distinct from that of other nations. So how does this read if instead of tongue, are we asking this question if instead of tongue that said language? If in every instance of tongue we said language, would we be having the same conversation?
I think so.
And I'm asking because of the association that we have with tongues and how that word has become, has developed its own unique meaning, speaking in tongues.
Well, I was just saying tongue because it makes me sound more spiritual. But language is what I was actually meaning.
1 Corinthians 13:1, at least in the NLT, says, if I could speak all the languages of earth and of angels. So it almost seems like there's an angelic language, and then there's a earthly language, like all the national tongues and whatever. I don't know if there's another word used there, but my NLT version for 13:1 says languages of earth and of angels.
Right, but it's still language, and the idea meaning, it's language that is spoken and understood in a place by multiple people. I mean, that we just talk about the meaning of the word. We're not getting into anything just yet.
Correct. So I think that's where, as far as I'm concerned, I haven't differentiated between tongue or language. Like it's all the same to me.
All right. So
according to the definition that you just gave, I feel like no, but I also don't understand that. So let's call it a language, right? I don't understand that language because in the denomination that I'm used to, that's not something that we do.
So pause before we go there. Let's just talk about, let's pretend for a second we don't know this phenomenon called speaking in tongues, and we have no point of reference for that. Let's take that and put it on a side just for a second. There is no point of reference for that. And you read this, and you consider what happened in Acts.
Right.
Do you shake out to that understanding? Because one of the things about Bible reading is an important thing is an idea called hermeneutics. Is a big word that talks about the assumptions and being aware of the assumptions that we bring and that we bring into the text. And that cause us to interpret the text by the things that we are bringing to the text and not the things that the text is saying. And it teaches us to standardize our assumptions or be at least aware of them so that they don't bleed in and color the way we receive it.
So I switched versions and I went to NIV verse 2 for 14:2. For anyone who speaks in a tongue, and so substitute that for language, does not speak to men but to God, right? Which
yes, but keep in mind the dynamic that's happening and the reason for this. So yes, Kevin, you're right. Paul is making that statement, but I'm starting with this so that we can understand what he's saying. I'm starting with language. If these people are experiencing the dynamic of having this experience where I don't know Spanish or French or Z, what language you speak where you're from? Just give me a dialect, anyone. The one with the knocks.
Zulu.
Right, let's go with
I got
Zulu,
like
right?
5 of them. Which one do you want? I got like 5 of them.
Let's go with the one with the knocks. All have knocks.
You want closer? Which one you want?
show
I
off.
want something that has a knock.
But
You know where you do that one.
Closer.
You're
Yeah.
gonna run through another one, Z? Just keep naming languages that nobody else can speak. Really?
Because we don't know them at all.
That's what I was telling you, right?
Yeah, no, run off 7 more.
But let's say that we all in this group, right? And every so often, Courtney starts speaking in that and starts knocking in his language. He doesn't even know what he's saying. He has no idea, right? But he has this dynamic ability to speak in this thing so that he's not understanding it himself. And there's nobody else in the room who speaks it but Z. And then Z leaves and he starts speaking it again. I'm trying to set the picture for the dynamic that's being set. These people are saying things. It's almost like if I start speaking French and I'm speaking fluent French and I don't even understand what I'm saying because I don't have any reference for French. It's not making sense to me. In that sense, if that is what is taking place, if you then reread what Kenrick just said, then I'm speaking to God and not to man. It doesn't have to be an unintelligible language.
Right.
But it can be.
Right.
I guess my point is that you're right. And
Yeah. But you have to take into consideration the dynamic that was experienced when it first started. You can't do this without Acts 2.
why not?
Because it's a gift of the Spirit.
You can't have an and. Like things don't change. No, things don't evolve. Things don't.
Yes, but the purpose, and even Paul speaks about it here. The idea is to speak with intelligence so that someone else can understand.
No, that's not what Paul said. Paul said these things happen, but I recommend that when you are in public, you do it so that other people can understand.
Right.
That doesn't mean that this unintelligible language doesn't occur in private between you and God. I guess that's what I'm saying.
So
I think you're right, but it doesn't necessarily, negate the other.
But the unintelligible is only for the people who speak the language.
Okay, so
Agreed.
let me chime in because I think this needs some flesh. And this is where I have to share this story. Oh, the verse, by the way, was Romans 8:26, where he talks about a language, uninterpretable, ununderstandable languages.
It actually said wordless groans.
Right, wordless groans. So
That's not a language.
Yeah, so it's not like a language. It's like which people call gibberish or whatever.
No. A wordless groan is more like a
It's like a sigh.
Na like that.
But that's interpretive because that may be how you sigh here, but someone else may sigh differently.
I'm not saying it's a sigh. I'm just saying it's an utterance.
Yes.
It's wordless, so there's no words involved.
Right. So it's speaking. That's not a word. You're not.
It's
saying
not a
words when
word.
You're speaking in tongues.
Right. You're not saying a word. You're saying something that doesn't make sense. So anyway, let me put flesh to this at the risk again of sounding crazy. Back in my early days, before we got married, Marcy had turned me on to this gift of the Spirit because I was much like everyone else. Like it doesn't make any sense. It can't be a foreign or a language not of earth. And so she gave me this pamphlet, and it talked about why tongues. And so I asked God for 3 days, because it brought up all these very same texts of scripture talking about utterances and heavenly language and languages of angels. So for 3 days, I prayed each night that if this is a gift of the Spirit, then I would like to know, and I would like to see it in my life. 3 straight days. On the third night, I was awakened around 2 a.m, and I heard a voice, and it just said, "Remember my word." And then I just started speaking in that language, and I fought like an alley cat to stop because it was so uncomfortable. I was in the midst of a good sleep, and then out of my sleep, I just started speaking that language, and it freaked me out. The next day, I was kind of afraid to go to sleep because I felt like it was going to happen again. And it did. But when it happened this time, I had a vision in my head of one of my childhood friends. And I hadn't talked with him. He's like a really good friend of mine. And we, as it goes, we were friends from the sandbox. We hadn't talked in about 5 or 6 years. His image popped in my head. And this language started again, and I fought, and I stopped, and it woke me up again, and I fought, and I stopped. But I just let it have its way until it finished. Next day, I'm at work, and around lunchtime, I'm sitting down eating. That friend calls me, and he tells me that he had a near-death situation. He was going to the bank that he normally goes to, and he heard something tell him, "Don't go in." And he didn't understand, and he fought it, and it came stronger, and he heard it was like tearing him, "Do not go into that bank." So he didn't go. Later on the news, he found out that that bank was robbed and 3 people were killed, and there was only 3 people in that bank. They were shot. And he felt like, well, that could have been him. Hadn't heard from him in 5 years. And his face pops up in my prayer, this moment that night before. Hard for me to process it, even to this day, but if I'm not thinking about it, I know what I asked for. I know I didn't understand the words that I was saying. I know that it wasn't a language that I'm familiar with. It sounded very much like what is spoken in these churches that do speak this. And an action took place afterwards. Make of that what you will, but this is where I feel like we just need to hear a real life experience to now process what we're reading and going, it could be, maybe not, but I have an account.
I hear you.
And I guess that's where I am.
So
That makes sense to me.
So is me and my limits.
You're not crazy either.
So is it okay? So is it something that, because this is why I say at times I made judgment without actually really thinking about, like an instant, like, oh, okay. Is it something that is like the Spirit moves, just like how you're saying you didn't plan to say what you said, right?
Mm.
Is it something like the Spirit moves on you and you say whatever you say? Because I notice it seems like a planned thing for a lot, not everybody, but it seems like a planned thing for a lot of people. And it's like, if we're saying it's languages, like I mentioned 13:1, it says language of earth and languages of angels. I'm assuming the language of angels we wouldn't speak in public because nobody's gonna understand what that is. But I'm assuming if you're speaking a language of angels, it wouldn't be necessarily you speaking it because you shouldn't know the language, right? Based on Acts, like it's not a language you already just knew and you're like, okay, today I'm gonna say, you know what I'm saying? It's not like you pulling from your arsenal and saying, hey, I'm gonna say whatever. So my concept is it's the spirit moving on you to say whatever you're saying. If it's a language of angels, it's you by yourself, or language of earth, it's you out in public for somebody to understand what it is that you're saying, and you had no previous knowledge of that language or whatever. It's not you planning it out in your song or planning it out in a conversation or planning it out in a presentation. So I don't know. That's just my...
No, and I guess that makes sense to me. Like the way I read this is not like it. First of all, there was a difference between that. There was a difference Paul used between, where he differentiated between language or tongue and prophesying, right? And he made it very clear as to what the difference was. And he said, essentially he was saying, you can, I'm fine with you speaking in tongue based upon this, or language, right? But I would like, not even mandating, but I would like it if you would prophesy, which means that whatever you're doing, you're strengthening other people so that they understand what you're saying. So once again, it wasn't a yes or no, right? It was just saying, and it almost, it's almost like the venue and the people there dictated what should be done.
So my
or what he preferred to be done.
If he's telling you he would prefer for you to do something, it's as if you have control over that thing. Like that's how that, at least that's how I'm that means it sounds like you have, so then it doesn't seem like it's something the spirit moves for you to do, because if the spirit moves you to do something, you just do it.
I actually have a question to ask on that.
Sorry?
Which I have a question I wanted to ask on that, which goes back to what Jared was saying about, we need to understand this text in the context of Acts, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in Acts 2, verse 6, so this is after they're speaking in another language. Verse 6 says, now when this was noised abroad, the multitude came together and were confounded, because that every man heard them speak in his own language.
Okay.
So to me, it sounds like, going back to your example, Jared, people are speaking languages that they may have never spoken before.
Mm-hmm.
French, Dutch, German. I mean, the Bible wasn't written in English, right? God didn't sit in English, French, or Spanish and give words to the prophets, right? It's whatever, it might be Hebrew, Aramaic, whatever. So you have these people who are speaking in languages they haven't known before, but there are other people there who are hearing them in, whatever language they're familiar with. So even for Ron's experience, he may have been speaking in a language known only to angels, whatever that language is. So it doesn't mean it's gibberish. It's just you're completely unfamiliar with it. You don't know it. And who knows, when you get to heaven, or maybe you have another experience, then where I think the line has to be drawn, if you can draw one, is these unintelligible utterances, this gibberish thing, right? But even figuring out what gibberish is difficult, because again, you don't know who knows what the heavenly language is, right? One other thing that's interesting, Jared, is I think you used you said it's, what was it, wordless groanings or something like that?
Yeah, Ron's text in Romans 8:26.
Right.
It was speaking about the Spirit praying for you with wordless groans or something like that.
So yeah, and so there are a couple of places that is used, that wordless groaning, that whatever that sound is, but it's not actually like forming a language, right?
Right.
But I'm really just curious if based on verse 6, it's just you're speaking a language that you may not have known before, but there will be people there who it's their native tongue and they could understand it and they could be edified by it? Or is it just stuff?
So
I think that's what Kendrick was saying, right? It's not an or, but an and.
So yes and no. So let's go to verse 28.
Of
right?
what?
1 Corinthians 14.
Okay.
After he goes through his soliloquy of he then comes to talk about practical application, and his practical application sheds some light on the understanding of the people about what is taking place and the conversation that he's having. In verse 28, he says, if there's no interpreter, the speaker should keep quiet in the church. That in itself suggests that whatever language it is has basis for other people to understand, which aligns with the context of Acts 2, of the dynamic of the gift of tongues, which was given. Because Paul is talking about in 14, a dynamic with the gift of tongues, which he talked about in 12, that the people were experiencing, that the Spirit initiated in Acts 2, right? And so I am not suggesting that we can pigeonhole or box the Spirit, but I am suggesting that the idea of, I'm going in to look at the understanding of the people who Paul is writing to and the dynamic that they're experiencing to be able for us to understand it, and not starting with the dynamic that we are experiencing and then reading that into the text, right? We have to start.
But this is context though. He's talking about a worship service. What I'm saying is it's not about worship. I'm just saying in general, like
right.
Period.
But yes, I am talking about in this scenario, would these people be talking about the dynamic that we are experiencing? Is that what they would understand Paul to be talking about? That's what I'm asking. What is the dynamic that they are experiencing? Forget what we know tongues to be. Let's try and understand what they are experiencing and then make sense of that. Because what we're doing instead is saying, this is what we have knowledge of.
But I disagree. That's what I'm saying. I disagree with that. I don't think we're doing that. I think we're taking what Paul said, and Paul in the verses in this chapter differentiates between the two. Right. He says there is something that you do when you're alone with God, right? That only you and him understand. And then there's something that you do here. And even when he says it here, he's not even, once again, he's given his opinion or his thought on what he believes should exist, right? Based upon whatever.
Yeah.
And so
that is happening
it's still
in a context, Kenrick. That's happening in a context of the gift of the Spirit that they've all had this experience of.
While in worship or with other people. Yes.
So it didn't just happen in worship. When the people went outside to talk in Acts 2, they weren't in worship.
I understand that. I'm saying here, him right here is talking about specifically when you're in a congregation of people. That's the text. I mean, that's the context of what he's saying here.
Yes.
Not Acts 2.
Yes, but he's talking about a dynamic which is akin to what happened in Acts 2. Maybe. But he is, because he's talking about the gift of tongues.
He could be.
No, he said it.
He's talking about the gift of tongues. I'm saying it could be akin to Acts 2. It could be. You could be right. I don't see it definitively in here. Yeah, I guess that's what I'm saying. Like we're trying to pigeonhole.
I'm not. I'm saying his response about how to do it sheds light on the understanding of the people about what he's talking about. The fact that he's going to say, because one of the things that the Bible says, and I think maybe it's the unintelligible means that I can't understand it, not that it can't be understood. In fact, the commentary on the Bible I have chooses to use the words unlearned, right? And because of the understanding of what the word tongues actually means. It means unlearned. It means that it exists, I just don't know it, right? And it's not. And if we go to the word, you'll see that it takes place in other places in the Bible. Hold on.
Now I have a question for you when you're finished with this thought.
Yeah. Every other place that the word tongue is used, it's referring to either the physical tongue or some kind of structured language, right? Which has to be taken into consideration when we talk in here. And it's a structured language, whether I understand the language or not.
But why can't it be a structured language that only God understands?
It could be.
Okay, that's all I'm saying.
That's all
I'm saying.
Yes, it could be that only God understands.
Yeah, that's all I'm saying.
However, why would Paul?
Dude, you can't say it could be and then however.
Right.
Here's what I'm saying. I am saying that the Spirit, the gift of the Spirit to speak in tongues was not for the people to edify themselves.
Right.
Correct.
Mm-hmm. That's what Paul was saying. Yeah.
Right? That's not what he said. He differentiated between speaking in tongues and prophesying. He said prophesying was specifically for other people. Speaking in tongues was not that, because he even goes through and says, he talks about someone speaking in tongues. He's like, I like you speaking in tongues. That's great. I wish everyone would do it. But if you're trying to edify and strengthen your brothers, I would prefer you to prophesy.
Right.
So he separates the two.
Public.
He's separating the two, but Kenrick, you're distorting this context. So let's go through it and read it. So
where are we reading?
Let's start from 1. Let's start from 1 and go through and read the whole thing in context. We'll read it all the way through and then come back to it. Right? So he says,
which
of love and eagerly desire the gifts of the Spirit.
Which translation are you reading from?
14:1. I'm reading New International Version.
Okay. Yeah.
Follow the way of love and eagerly desire the gifts of the Spirit, especially prophecy. For anyone who speaks in a language, an unknown language or unlearned language, does not speak to people but to God. Right? And he's saying that unlearned, if you're not talking to the people in front of you, you're talking to God. Because the people in front of you can't understand you. But we'll see that that's how it works out when we keep going. Indeed, no one understands them. They utter mysteries by the Spirit because they're doing it without their own knowledge or power, right? But anyone who prophesies speaks to people for their strengthening, encouraging, and comfort. Now, when you're speaking prophesying, you're speaking in a language that you master or know. And I think that is the distinction he's making. Speaking in a language I know versus speaking in a language I don't know, right? And the listener knows.
Well, but everyone who prophesies speaks to men for their strengthening, encouragement, and comfort. I don't know if I hear that they necessarily know it. That means that the other person knows it. So when I hear prophesying,
We'll see later on.
Okay. All right.
I would like everyone you to speak in tongues, but I would rather have you prophesy. Now, we have to pause here and go back to 12, because one of the challenges that the Corinthian church was having is that the people were ranking themselves upon which gift each person has, right? So some people were saying, well, they were better because they have tongues, and other people were this and other people were that. So he said 12 to kind of say, well, the same gift God is giving all the gifts. Right? And here are some gifts, and these gifts are all coming from the Spirit, and they're all important. Now he's talking about in that melee of ranking the gifts, you're also creating confusion, because when you come into the place with your self of importance and your gift, you create chaos in this space. And so now he's addressing that. You have to remember what the letter is about in order to make sense of what he's saying. And so so when he says, I want everybody to have this wonderful experience, but let's take it down a notch a little bit. It's kind of what he's saying. So he's acknowledging it as being from God, being important, and being desirous. And it's sitting on the backdrop of 12. Yes? All right. So the one who prophesies is greater than the one who speaks in tongues, unless someone interprets, so that the church may be edified. So again, he's saying that this thing has to have interpretation for it to have value. And for him to say that it has to have interpretation for it to have value would suggest that it's a thing that can be interpreted.
Okay.
So, good? Go ahead. Let me just go through six first. Our brothers and sisters, if I come to you and speak in tongues, what good would I be to you unless I bring you some revelation or knowledge or prophecy or word of instruction? Again, this is the context in which the tongues gift was given in the first place. Remember, Acts 2. Acts 2 is also a backdrop to what Paul is saying here and has to be factored in. Even in the case of lifeless things that make sound, such as a pipe or a harp, how will anyone know what tune is being played unless there is a distinction in the notes? So again, this is an idea about structured language now that has to have some kind of clear melody or tune to make sense, because he's now using the illustration to liken it. There's no value to random notes all over the place unless there's a melody. It's again, if the trumpet does not sound a clear call, who will get ready for battle? So it is with you. Unless you speak intelligible words with your tongue, how will anyone understand what you're saying? Paul is starting off his argument about the value of the words making sense to other people. But then he goes into saying, even if you don't understand it, there's value in it still. But the greater value is in the understanding of others. And he's saying that not just about the prophecy, but about the tongues as well. In his opening, you will just be speaking into the air. Undoubtedly, and here he's setting the context, undoubtedly there are all sorts of languages in the word, yet none of them is without meaning. Right? If then I do not grasp the meaning of what someone is saying, I am a foreigner to the speaker, and the speaker is a foreigner to me. All of this context is describing languages, structured languages, and the importance and the necessity of, or the significance of the language to have the ability to be translated. But there's not always someone there who can translate. But this thing can be translated. My daughter posts in the chat, the Amplified Version says, now believers, if I come to you speaking in unknown languages or unknown tongues, how would I benefit you unless I also speak to you clearly, either by revelation? All right? So it is with you. Since you are eager for the gifts of the Spirit, try to excel in those that build up the church. I'm going to pause here for a second to take Lorraine's question before we go into some more.
Okay, so this leads me to think that there's a difference between Acts 2, not complete different, and whatever this is. Because Acts 2, we're assuming that's Pentecost, right? Is that the Pentecost? Yes. Okay. So maybe something's not clicking. So Acts 2, the Spirit moved on them and they just started speaking. And people around them were hearing, everybody in their own language was hearing what they were saying in their own tongue, right? Okay. So no, they didn't plan it, they didn't whatever. This seems like it's something you could be like, okay, I'm not gonna say it right now. Like that's not really, it seems like something he's telling you how to use and maneuver and whatever, and that seems opposite, because if the Spirit is moving you to speak something, first of all, he's not gonna move you to speak it and it not help. You know what I'm saying? It's not gonna just have you saying stuff for the sake of just saying things. So if the Spirit moves you to speak, somebody in there has got to know what you're saying, right? So for him to tell you, say it here, don't say it here, use it here, like that doesn't sound like something that is just like you have no control. You just say what, because like I said, it's not something you know, not a language you planned on speaking. It's not something you came in like, okay, we're gonna have a meeting today. You're the only one that can speak tongues today. Tomorrow's your turn. Like that seems so. It's not clicking. Something's not clicking for me after reading this. Like it's not. It sounds like he's trying to control the spirit, which, you know, I'm not trying to sound crazy, but that's what it sounds like. Or if this is something different or a different part of, I don't know. There's something not. I can't see why he would be given instructions on how to do something that the spirit gave you to do. The spirit's not going to tell you to do something that's not going to be beneficial. And if he's going to have you speak to people, somebody in there should know what you're saying.
So
go
ahead.
I think, Lorraine, that he was addressing a specific problem with this specific group of people.
Mm-hmm.
So the problem was, as Jared was saying, that people felt like certain gifting was above other giftings.
Okay.
And so it seems as if Paul is trying to say, hey, for the good of the community, so that everybody understands, try not to do this whenever we gather, try not to do this. So it was, I don't necessarily think he's trying to, I know what you meant. I'm gonna just use the same terms because I can't find a better way to say it. I don't think he's trying to control the spirit or control the gift. And it's more so of just be mindful that it can cause a little bit of rift inside the community.
Yeah, because they're all Corinthians. They all come from the same place. They all speak in the same language. There's not a great diversity among them because it's a small house church. It's maybe 50 people, maybe. It's not a 3,000-seater church. You understand? So it's a small community of homogeneous people in Corinth, from Corinth.
But with the
and some of them have experienced this dynamic and they still have this ability.
So Lorraine, I think I understand what you're trying. I think I understand what you're trying to say. Are you asking about the supernatural experience versus the decision, your personal? I'm just going to speak in tongues now.
Yeah, because it sounds. I mean, what we're reading sounds like you have control over the thing. Like.
Right.
Act 2 doesn't sound like you had no control. Like the thing is happening and it's gonna do what it's gonna do.
And this is what I'm not. Well, I'll say this and then I'll go to what I wanted to say to you, Jared. So it keeps going back to me as a not an or but an and.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the only example I can give, and I don't know how accurate this is, and maybe Avani can relate. It's like singing.
Mm-hmm.
And when you're singing to the Lord, and then, but when you're singing and like during praise and worship, whatever, and you just know the spirit is just taking over, and you just kind of go in a different place. I'm not talking about another language or anything. There's something that happens, and that's the only way I can explain it. So I'm just saying that it's not I don't believe it's an or. I believe it's an and. And so to what you were saying, Jared, the struggle I'm having, and I'm still landing here with Kendrick with the and, not the or. And the struggle I'm having with your break, how you went through this is 1 Corinthians 12:8. Because if I am, well, let's see, not 8.
Gifts of the Spirit.
Gifts of the Spirit, yeah, 12, yeah, 8 or 10, was it? 10. From the sound of it, I could be wrong, correct me if I'm wrong. From the way you describe, go through that, you're saying is it your belief that there was an actual language being spoken there that some people were able to understand?
I am saying that people have been given abilities by the gift of the Spirit, like 12 says. Some have healing and some have this gift to speak in other languages. And that every time they speak in that language, it's not necessarily a movement of the Spirit, but residual of the ability that they've been given. They're being able to speak in language that they are not familiar with. It's a language that someone else is familiar with.
Correct. Okay. So I hear that. And why I'm just one question, wondering about is because with the gifts.
And I'm also saying that they're in a homogeneous place where everybody speaks the same language. And like we all speak in English, and Z all of a sudden often, starts knocking in our meetings.
Gotcha.
Right?
Okay. So if someone speaks that language, right, that no one else speaks, but Z just comes in and speaks this language, and then someone understands that language, does that person have the gift of interpretation? Just because they speak the same language? Because it sounds like a foreign language.
Maybe you might have someone who has the gift of interpretation, but because it's a familiar language, someone somewhere knows it. That's my
they have the interpretation. They just speak that language, and I think this is where
the gift is. Just to be clear, the gift is I am speaking French I'm speaking perfect fluent French with no background exposure to French. The Spirit has blessed me with the ability to communicate in French, and I don't even understand it. Just like the Spirit has blessed me with the ability to heal somebody with my shadow, right? Same kind of blessing from the Spirit. It wasn't something I possessed inherently. It wasn't something I naturally possessed.
I get that.
The Spirit has now given me this ability.
I get all of that. I guess I'm talking about now the gift of interpretation of tongues. Because the gift of interpretation of tongues doesn't come across to me as someone that can speak a foreign language. The gift of interpretation of tongues can just as easily be someone that can interpret gibberish.
Yeah, well, the unlearned language.
Which growing up, I've experienced that. But it's so to me, again, breaking out everything you just broke down in these verses is still an and. It's not an or. It still proves the point of an and in here. So that's why I just want
to tell me more about the and, because maybe that's what's not clear to me. I'm not saying it's not an and. I am only saying that the reason why we have the word gibberish to distinguish from language is because language, no matter whether it's different or not, has structure.
Right. I get that.
It's a melody that moves in language. In fact, I don't know if you've watched Lord of the Rings, but all the foreign languages there were created, but they were created as real languages because they were given these structures.
Same thing with Star Trek, yes.
Game of Thrones, yeah.
Right? And so gibberish by definition is not a language. It is these notes all over the place. It's a melody-less thing.
But gibberish is our term.
Right.
That's not what they say in the text.
Right. So all I'm saying is that's what I'm trying to draw the distinction between language.
But I guess
all language
gibberish. No, I'm just saying language, whatever it is, whether it be heavenly or earthly.
But you're saying whatever the language is, it has to be a structured language.
No. I am saying that language by definition is structured. So if it is a language, it will be structured.
Yeah.
That's what I'm saying.
We may not understand the structure, or we may not even know it's structured, right? Is that what you're saying?
Because it's unknown to us.
So I don't know French. And when people around me speak it, I don't make sense of it. But it's structured. I don't know Chinese, and it sounds crazy to me. But I can hear the structure in it. I don't know any of these dialects. But when they play them on TV, they're structured.
So as long as you can determine if it's structured, then
no, I'm not saying if
I guess that's what I'm saying
language identifies itself. Language identifies itself by its structure.
I understand. I can't get there.
I guess I've heard people speak in gibberish tongues and it sounded structured to me.
And that's fine. I'm not saying yes or no on that. But again, I'm not here to judge whether what people are doing is gibberish or not. I am using the language in the scripture to help us build context around making sense of the dynamic Paul is speaking to. And Paul is speaking to language, whatever that looks like. And I am not judging one language over the other, but I am helping us define language.
So I think
make sense?
I think it's also very important to pay. I'm pretty sure we've said it before, but I feel like we kind of strayed a little bit from it. I think it's extremely important for us to be mindful of the intention behind the letter that Paul wrote. So there was a problem happening in that church, and he was trying to address it there. And I think sometimes, I'm not trying to be blasphemous, but I think sometimes we can take letters or instructions given to us, this specific person or a set of people, and use it as okay, this is how it's supposed to be. But there's value in understanding why Paul was telling them, hey, try not to.
Yeah, and just to Avanique's point, which speaks to Acts 2, verse 22, says, languages, therefore, are not for believers, but for unbelievers. And think about the response that the people gave in Acts 2. These people have to be from God because I can hear them in my own language. So that there's significance in these gifts that the Spirit is giving to reveal these people as having a connection with God. And having this, and to make believers understand. And so he's saying, it's not for you guys. This has benefit for those. And it really only has benefit to the believer if they can understand it. Is what he's saying here.
Not disagreeing.
Jared,
Agreed, Jared.
I wanted to add a spanner in the works of sorts, right? So I'm a PK, and I remember my dad sharing an experience with us. He was on a missionary trip to, I think it's Brazil, and he had his interpreter with him. Interpreter got, I don't know, some sort of bug and couldn't interpret. He was out. But my dad was praying about it, and Spirit told him, okay, go out and speak anyway. So he went out, he preached, and everyone in the audience is, nodding along, and when he says give glory to God or whatever, they raise their hands and whatnot. And then it turns out that they're saying, so he's speaking English, which is what he knows, but they're saying that they heard him in Spanish. So this is kind of like, I guess, what Marcella was saying, where maybe, so I don't know, is it that somewhere between what he said and what they heard, the Holy Spirit intervened and did some sort of translation? I don't know. Is it that he will give them the gift of interpretation so they heard? But again, that's how we can't pigeonhole it.
All of the above. But the context in which it's happening is this understanding that shows that this message is coming from God.
Right.
In all of these contexts, that's what's happening. And that's what Paul is speaking to in this chapter. To make sure that this thing is happening in a way that people understand that it's coming from God. And if that is not happening, put a pause on it. It is a valuable gift to have, but it's not for us here in the Greeks. Save it for someone to whom it benefits, and you and God do that in the corner. Is really what he's saying.
But that sounds like you can control it. Oh.
I'm going to say it's an ability in some cases. I'm going to do both and on this.
Right. Okay. That's because
there's opportunities where the Spirit comes in and manifests, but then there's also maybe a retained something that you can control, or you can just decide not to speak. It's not that you control it; you just decide I'm not going to speak.
Yeah, but it's kind of like what Ron was saying, right? Where God gives you wisdom, so you wouldn't go, decked off in your best jewels in the hood at 4 a.m. Probably not a good idea, right? That's wisdom. But then there may be times where God will just impact you and tell you, hey, don't drive down this street, don't go into the bank, don't whatever. So it's not that, to your point, I don't think it's one or the other. There are times when, he will move, the Spirit will move, and there are other times he will just give you the wisdom that he expects you to now choose what your actions are, right?
Yeah. Let's read 22 through 25, because I think this is a key foundation around the idea that Paul is trying to communicate through each of his steps.
Are you in 12 or 14?
14. Tongues then are a sign not for believers, but for unbelievers. Prophecy, however, is not for unbelievers, but for believers. So and probably we should look at that word prophecy as well, just to understand what Paul is saying there. But I'm going to get to that in a second. So if the whole church comes together and everyone speaks in tongues, the inquirers or unbelievers, and everyone speaks in tongues, and inquirers or unbelievers come in, will they not say you are out of your mind? But if an unbeliever or inquirer comes in while everyone is prophesying, they are convicted of sin and are brought under judgment by all, as the secrets of the hearts are laid bare. So they will fall down and worship God, exclaiming, God is really among you. So that the idea is that communication, whether it be prophecy or tongues, should lead people towards understanding or some revelation from God or about God, and should be some kind of sign that brings people to an awareness of God's power through you. And if it's not doing that in the setting and it's within your power, hold off on that.
So I used to.
And that now brings us to the dynamic that we're discovering. This is why I wanted to do it this way. The dynamic we're discovering, whether it is a genuine language or not, is not about that. It's not about understanding. It's not about edification. It's about showing that I have the Spirit. It's rooted in that. And it's not true for everyone. It's not universal. But the vast majority of that dynamic is that. And so even if what we are calling gibberish is a heavenly language, and I'm not saying it is or it isn't, even if Paul would say, shut up, the same way to that, for the same reason. And I think that is why I went the route that we were going at, so that we could properly evaluate the dynamic, not on whether it's a language or not, because who's to know, right? Right. Who's going to know for real? You can't really tell whether it actually is a language or not, particularly if you've never heard the language. But you can identify the spirit in which whatever is happening is sitting.
Verse 40 sums it up nicely.
Maybe. I can't get there.
Verse 40 sums it up nicely. It's basically just doing everything decently and in order.
Correct.
So,
and here's what I'm saying, Henrik. Paul is admonishing that if you break out in that spirit, so in that experience, people do it not to bring revelation, not to maybe to think that they're praying to God, but they do it in a way that brings attention to them. Yes, that
maybe. I guess my thing is maybe.
I don't know how you heard it. I don't know how you heard that. Like it was like under her breath.
Paul better not tell it to shut up.
I heard it in Spanish.
I am not saying, Kenrick, that everybody does it, because I know some people who are very sincere, who in the middle of prayer or worship or whatever go into that, But I'm talking about that dynamic as it's fostered, sits in that space. I don't think that any of us who've experienced this could actually speak to, and I'd be excited to hear about it, where it gets, where some real message or revelation is given.
Listen, I can tell you, it wasn't fun at all.
So I'll say, I used
scared
to
the life out of me.
I used to lead worship at a Baptist church in New York, and I would notice that they would start speaking in tongues when, it's a horrible way to describe it, but just because I can't find a better way. Whenever worship was high, that would be like the next level for them. And to me, because I grew up in an Adventist, I was coming from an Adventist background, it wasn't something that I understood. But the vibe, wow. What I picked up from what was happening was that I'm in worship and there's an intimacy in my worship. I didn't understand, but I was probably the only Adventist the musicians were Adventist too, and we didn't understand, but that was just because we don't do this in an Adventist faith. We have no experience with that. It was literally just us going, okay, they're doing their thing. It's the same thing when they started shouting. I am from a religious heavy Caribbean Adventist church. getting the congregation to get involved, even when you're singing hymns, is they think it's irreverent to, you know, raise your hands and shout hallelujah. And so when you're in a new setting where people are shouting and at the top of their voice, you know, they're dancing and doing whatever, there is always that rift between like, are they bugging out or am I just not used to the experience? And I found that it's easy to be judgmental, but it's also, the more you're around it and the more you start realizing that sometimes it's just their way of worshiping. And it's hard to quantify it or say this is right or this is wrong. And you can't tell anybody's intention, but it just, to me, at that church, it seemed as if this was another level of worship that I just wasn't used to.
Right. I just want to say, just to clarify my position, I am not in any way knocking what the people are doing or attempting to judge their motivations, because I believe that there are sincere people in and among for whom, like Abonique is saying, this is a part of their worship, and I know a few of them, right? And so that's not what I'm saying. I am saying that what Paul is talking about here gives us a guide to be able to filter the experiences, right? And to guide us for those spaces as a community. It gives us a framework for guiding us in those spaces. And so I am only saying that what Paul is actually trying to communicate is that in these communal spaces, when we come together, if you're not saying something that everybody can benefit from, save that for when you go home.
Right.
Right.
That's what Paul is saying. And that's one of the things I'm hoping that become the main thing in this, because that's the message that he's bringing. He's not really talking about the validity of language. You know, he's not really doing that. And that gives us a framework for examining what we are saying. If that's Paul's message, what does that mean for this dynamic we're talking about?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm gonna take Marcella, and then I'm gonna go to the comments in the chat, unless you want to do that first.
I was just going to add real fast, and I grew up in it. I've seen it done decently and in order, and I've seen it not done decently and in order. So I completely agree to what Jared point as to what we're really talking about here. And to Lauren, don't feel bad. I grew up in it and I judged when they did it. Lorraine, sorry, I keep saying Lorraine. Thank you, Lorraine. And I grew up in it and I judged, because you can always tell those. But no, I'm not going to go there. But it is difficult. So that's why I agree with Jared that it is very important that we don't look at it as the actual language or not. Are they doing this or not? But to the context of, is this edifying the church? Is this edifying to us, which is what we're supposed to be doing daily anyway?
Yeah,
so
there are some stories.
Yeah, there's some story. Yeah.
Joe asks, the Spirit's play for us believers with groanings that cannot be uttered in a heavenly language. I don't really know what language the Spirit is praying in. Spirit, I think, is versatile. He could pray in English, he could pray in Dutch, he could pray in a language we don't know that they do speak in heaven. Aramaic. I don't know. I'm not even sure that it matters. I think what the point of Romans 8:26 is, when we don't know what to say, the Spirit fills the gap. And how he does it, I think, this is my opinion now, is really irrelevant. Like whether he does, whether it's a heavenly language or my language, I'm not sure that it's relevant. If it is the Spirit speaking, Paul better not tell it to shut up.
I love it.
So I don't think Paul is telling the Spirit not to shut up. I think Paul is saying, try and see there's an interpreter. And you have to keep in mind who he's talking to. He's not talking to a worldwide church.
Right.
He's talking to people who only speak one language, really.
And he's also addressing the constant drama that was happening because.
Correct. The people were standing up out of turn and just,
right,
and making a scene and carrying on. So he's really not speaking to whether the Spirit is speaking or not, but people, trying to show themselves that self, making it about me. I have the Spirit, watch me. Ooh, watch me, watch me. Did that always go? I think so.
Watch me.
I get what you're saying,
My
Jai.
bad.
Different context. In a church setting, let everything be done decently in order. But like Marcella said, it's an and, not an or. Best quote of the night. Yeah. 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 Okay. Are we good with this? Are we done with this? Are there some residuals that need to take up afterwards? Afterwards.
No, yeah, we're good with this.
All right. Z, which one of your three would you like to go with?
I'm gonna let you choose.
All right, I'm gonna go with this one.
No.
Next.
What's the second one?
Yeah.
Yes. Third one.
Yeah.
You don't want the third one.
That's a good one because that was sort of like what I was pulling.
I don't have an answer for that one.
I had a similar question along these lines. So let's dance here.
No, seriously, we're good on the other two, right?
Okay.
Yeah. It's no and no, and let's move on.
Well,
I mean,
actually,
there's an and, but it's no and no.
No and no and. What time is it? No and well, no, just no and no.
I would push back on the first one. That the first answer is yes, and I think examining what was the significance of what Jesus came to do is important, particularly if we are believers. But maybe we shouldn't do that right this second. We'll start with this one, but
maybe purposeful sin. We can live a life where we're not purposefully sinning. Yes,
correct.
We can unintentionally sin because we may not be aware of everything that we do. We'll give them that.
But
Because I've heard it said.
Dude, you just went back to number one.
Yeah.
I
I had heard
just
other
went back to
things. That's
number
why I asked that. I had heard that we actually can, but I'm gonna leave it alone. I'm gonna leave it
We
alone.
covered this one not too long ago.
Yeah. Sin without intent. Yeah, there we go. Okay.
I want the second one.
And it didn't end anyway. It didn't settle, so it won't settle this time either.
All right. First Samuel 16.
This is a really good question right here.
Yes, this is.
All right. So let's go there. First Samuel 16.
I actually never thought about this question.
Yeah, that's some of the question I was asking. All right. So Z, Marcella says she needs some clarity on your question.
Okay, so the reason why I asked it is because let me see. First Samuel. So maybe we should go to First Samuel 16, right? But the Lord said to Samuel, "Do not consider his appearance or his eyes, for I rejected him." Right? And then he says, "The Lord does not look at things people look at. People look at the outward appearance. The Lord looks at the heart." But then when we go back to when Saul was chosen, God is the one who he literally handpicked him. Like, you know what I'm saying? Samuel didn't do that. He chose him. So did he not look at his heart just like he did David? Or
And that's why I enjoy this question, because I had a similar notion. I'm reading this now and I'm seeing, like, the times past I've read this and I always thought Saul got a bad deal, but I'm reading it this time and I'm like, no, he was pretty horrible from the written account. Like, he didn't do anything right at all. And I wonder why God chose him and then say later on that he regretted choosing him. So I'm like, yeah, I'm with Z here. I'm like, well, so what was the consideration? Because when he went to David, that process seemed to be a little more thorough in the writing. And this could be subject to the interpretation of the writer.
He was an impressive young man, and he was taller than everybody else.
Right. So with David was a whole lot more thorough of a process than Saul. I think we can all look at that and see what he went through with David was much more integral than what he went through with Saul. Saul's process resulted exactly what you would think you would get. This guy was no good. I mean, he failed in every possible avenue.
Yeah, I look at it differently.
Kwame Brown and Steph Curry.
What? Wow. When I look at it, it's really more about timing, right? So, because David did some pretty horrible things. I dare say even perhaps more horrible than what Saul did. David didn't kill himself. David had time to repent. Saul chose not to repent and to end his life. So, for us,
makes him horrible.
Sorry?
What's that again?
That's what makes him horrible, right? I mean,
right, but
considering he was the first person that God chose to lead the people, and his actions were just like they weren't good at all. I mean,
but
David,
there were some things that David. I don't remember David repenting,
God, right? Because there's this concept of predestination that God has everything figured out, and He's gonna. So it's like you have no free will, no control. And I think this passage actually disproves that theory, because you're seeing where God is saying, "Look, I know how this is going to end up, but I'm going to choose you. I'm going to send my Holy Spirit. I'll give you every opportunity to make it right, even if I know at the end of it you're still going to botch it, right?"
And
so
I can give you that, right?
God knows you botch it isn't precluding Him being merciful and giving you good opportunities and all that good stuff.
I can give you that, but it's just that God came, and later on it says that He regretted choosing Saul.
Yeah, but it also said He regretted, some of the decisions He made with Israel. Even when Moses would tell you, God would actually say, "Well, I'm going to wipe them out," and Moses would be like, "No, don't do that." And I repent of that decision. I won't just obliterate them, right?
I'm gonna let
Sharif has gone from 1 finger to 5 fingers.
That's not so. I saw the number go up, so I'm like, I'm gonna go ahead.
Yeah, I don't bang with Pablo, but now we know we off him. I got something to say. Perhaps when I read this, it says God looks on the heart. God looked at the heart of Saul, and perhaps the heart of Saul reflected the heart of the people at that time. And perhaps He literally gave them what they thought they wanted. And this ain't going as I planned. And so I'm going to now look at the heart for another reason. I don't think we should assume that the heart looking means that it was favored, God's favor or not. It's just I examined the person, and during that time, it was what the people thought they wanted or needed at the time.
But is the heart
in that decision, is that a godly move, right? God doesn't go with just what the people want. He gives the people what they need.
Remember that God gave the people the king because the people wanted a king. They wanted a human king. And so He had to have picked somebody who was kingly in their eyes. David being the first king wouldn't have worked, because I'm looking at all these other ones and whoa, this one don't look like, this ain't it, God, ain't gonna work. So I got to give you something that, Saul, I don't know how we say it in the American English. He was a trampling man. I don't know what the word is. What is the word? He was tall. They said it in here. He was tall and impressive. He had stature.
He
was kingly.
Royal.
That's English.
And so, no, what I said before wasn't though, Kenrick. I said
I don't know what trampling. I don't.
Okay. All right, but I think here God looks at everybody's heart, but it all depends on what you can accept at the moment. That's how I took it. And the next one,
that makes sense.
And then the next one, now that Saul, this ain't working out, and Samuel's like, all right, don't follow appearance anymore. This ain't gonna work. I'm gonna turn the other way because I'm looking at it again, and I know what they need.
So in the comments, Mike said Saul's heart was in the right place when he was chosen. It was when Saul got full of himself that he lost sight of God and moved on, and God moved on to David, which I think is a very, very valid point, because I don't get, there isn't a part of the story where it seems as if like God picked Saul because, all right, he's evil and I need him to I need to play him as a pawn. It seems as if Saul's heart was in the right place, and then the power got to his head, which is what God told the Israelites would happen. Like, you're gonna have a king, and it's not gonna go down the way you think it's going to go.
So all right, because here's like the issue that I have here. When they go to fight the Philistines, like before when they won, he won the first battle rather easily, and then the fight with the Philistines came around right around verse 12, and this is where I look and I go, okay, so this is a problem. Samuel makes the speech and he tells the people that God's not going to forsake them because and this is verse 22, for the Lord will not forsake his people for his great name's sake, because it has pleased the Lord to make a people for himself. And then we go into chapter 13 where they actually go and fight the Philistines and the people are afraid. So this is like the first real test for Saul. And in this first real test, this is where you see the character of the man, right? He starts to shake because the people start to shake, and then he jumps the gun and does the unlawful sacrifice, which is the first step in pushing out. And so I'm like, this is where I'm going, why choose him? You knew this was going to be that guy. You knew he wasn't. And to know that Samuel makes this speech, he respects Samuel, and whenever I'm like through the text of the Old Testament, whenever you see for God's great name, he takes that very seriously. So those were the convincing speech for him to know to stand. Even if Samuel did arrive late, it was still on Saul to lean on that word to go, okay, well, God's not going to forsake me. Even if Samuel was late, God's not going to forsake us. But instead, he took it upon himself to do something that he should not have done. And then that just showed what he kept doing throughout afterwards. It just fell apart from there.
Ron, do you realize though that a lot of the character traits of Saul in that respect are very similar to Moses, where he starts off good. Sorry?
How so? Yeah.
Well, he starts off really good, but then he starts allowing the people to dictate what he does. And by acting to please the people, it actually keeps him out of the promised land. Because little by little, it's almost like instead of, strictly following what God says to please the people, all right, you want me to hit the rock twice or whatever it is, I'll do it. You want me to overlook certain things, I'll do it. And then it ends up, costing him the promised land. Fortunately, he repented before his death and he was resurrected. And, maybe if Saul didn't kill himself, he might have, repented too, and the story might have ended differently. We don't know. But the point I'm making is God will give everybody, he knows what he's put in you, and he's going to give you every opportunity for that to come to fruition, for that gift, that talent, that calling, that purpose to, come to fruition. What you choose to do with it, or how you choose to end the story, is entirely in your hands. But it's not that God is going to be like, oh snap, I know Jerome is going to mess up in 10 years, so I won't give him any opportunities, or I will withhold blessings or gifts or platforms from him because he might do this. Because if that was the metric, then he'd have withheld, the kingdom from David as well, right?
So that's an interesting point. All right, so what you're saying here, if I'm hearing you right, is that God's looking at what Saul, in God's eyes, what Saul could have been, kind of like what Gideon, when the angel came to him and told him he was a warrior of God when he was really cowering away from the battle.
Right.
So God is looking at the potential of Saul and saying,
yeah, because he knows what he's put in you. Now, what you choose to do with it, I read this quote that said, the one regret we should have if we make it to heaven is for God to show us where he designed us to be and where we actually were. So if God has this purpose for you, and yes, you're saved, you're secure, you get to heaven, and then he opens the books and shows you, yeah, but you're here, but I really meant for you to be here.
Okay. I can see that. I can definitely see that.
So I don't think that you can process the relationship with Saul and David and God's choice without including Jeroboam. Let's turn to 1 Kings 11. 1 Kings 11 from verse 26. So chapter 11 starts with Solomon's wives. Let's go from verse 9.
You
The
said
Lord
verse
had,
7, right?
1 Kings 11 verse 9.
Okay.
1 Kings 11:9. The Lord had become angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. Although he had forbidden Solomon to follow other gods, Solomon did not keep the Lord's commands. Now, I seem to remember God having conversation with Solomon when he built the temple and before he built the temple and telling him he was going to be with him and all them kind of things, right?
Mhm.
And almost chose Solomon the same way. Although David had a hand in that and Bathsheba had a hand in that. So I'm going to say, God specifically chose it, but he had some conversations. But here's what God says to Solomon. So the Lord said to Solomon, since this is your attitude and you have not kept my covenant and my decrees, which I commanded you, I will most certainly tear the kingdom away from you and give it to one of your subordinates. Nevertheless, for the sake of your father David, not because his heart was right when he chose him, but because of how his heart was throughout. And you see it because David falls, like as Kenrick says, probably even worse than Saul does in terms of action. But his posture and his response to being called out was very different. I will not do it during your lifetime. I will tear it out of the hand of your son. Yet I will not tear the whole kingdom from him, but will give him one tribe for the sake of my servant David, and for the sake of Jerusalem, which I have chosen. And then Solomon gets some adversaries, and then we'll start with verse 26. Also, Jeroboam, son of Nebat, rebelled against the king. He was one of Solomon's officials, an Ephraimite from Zeredah, and his mother was a widow named Zeruiah. Here's the account of how he rebelled against the king. Solomon had built terraces and filled a gap in the wall in the city of David, his father. Now, Jeroboam was a man of standing, and when Solomon saw how well the young man did his work, he put him in charge of the whole labor forces of the tribes of Joseph. About that time, Jeroboam was going out to Jerusalem, and Ahijah, a prophet from Shiloh, met him on the way wearing a cloak. The two of them were alone out in the country, and Ahijah took hold of the new cloak he was wearing and tore it into 12 pieces. Then he said to Jeroboam, take 10 pieces for yourself, for this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. See, I am going to tear the kingdom out of Solomon's hands and give you 10 tribes. But for the sake of my servant David and the city of Jerusalem, which I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel, he will have one tribe. I will do this because they have forsaken me and worshipped Ashereth, the goddess of the Sidonians, Chemosh, the god of the Moabites, and Molech, the god of the Ammonites, and have not walked in obedience with me, nor have they done what is right in my eyes, nor kept my decrees and laws as David, Solomon's father, did. But I will not take the kingdom out of Solomon's hand, the whole kingdom out of Solomon's hands. I have made him ruler all the days of his life for the sake of my son, for the sake of David, my servant, whom I chose and who obeyed my commands and decrees. I will take the kingdom from his son's hands and give you 10 tribes. I will give one tribe to his son so that my servant David may always have a lamp before me in Jerusalem, the city where I chose to put my name. However, for you, I will take you and you will rule over all that your heart desires. You will be king over Israel. If you do whatever I command you, and walk in obedience to me and do what is right by obeying my decrees and my commands, as my servant David did, I will be with you. I will build you a dynasty as enduring as the one I built for David and will give Israel to you. I will humble David's descendants because of this, but not forever. So to Z's question about heart, how is God selecting these kings? And did he select Jeroboam differently than he selected David, differently than he selected Saul?
Is that an open question?
Yes.
I mean, yeah.
Good. So Z, what happened with Saul?
What do you mean? What happened with Saul?
If God looked at his heart, because as you pointed out rightly, the people asked for a king, and God chose a king for them. First, he chose Saul.
Right.
Then he chose David. David's son got the throne, acted a fool, and then he chose Jeroboam. God did the choosing in those cases. And if Samuel is telling the people he didn't choose David's brothers because of how they look, but because of their hearts, you would have to believe that God is consistent.
Yeah, I believe he's consistent.
But
it just seemed, I guess for me, it just seemed like it was like, okay. At that time, it just seemed like, did you not look at his heart? David? Did you not see what he was going to do? Just like what David was going to do? Like, to me, it's like, you are God and you are Sarah. So to me, it's like, this seems like it was a mistake. Did you make, you know what I mean? So I know that it was a mistake because God doesn't make mistakes, right? I'm very much aware of that. But however, it just seemed like, okay, did you not? And I mean, now as we're talking, I get that it's not. It wasn't God. It was Saul who was changing. You know what I mean? And he wasn't following the decrees like everybody else or whatever. He just was choosing to do. He was choosing to do him, right? I get that, but I kind of expected God to not.
Saul,
knowing that this is what he's gonna do, you know.
People aren't
you
fixed.
gave, huh?
People aren't fixed. Just because I'm in this place today doesn't mean I'm in that place tomorrow, and whether I'm in that place tomorrow is a factor of my choice. Manasseh is a perfect example of that. On the opposite side, though.
I also think that if God had chosen based on eternity, which is what I'm kind of receiving, Z, then the whole dynamic of having choice ceases to exist. To Jared's point, I chose you based on where you are now and the multiple decisions that you could have made for your future. I hope you picked the right one. All of them are options of you. And right now, you're in a position that I believe I can use you. When you're no longer in that, pardon?
If you stay faithful.
Right.
If you stay faithful.
Right. And when you're no longer in that position, we're going to have a heart-to-heart. I'm going to remind you that you're not in it. You choose to continue to be not in it. You got to go. Like that just, it kind of seems
so
like
he's
like that.
So the three, if God is consistent, what are we saying that what is it based upon?
Say again? You broke up.
If we're saying God is consistent,
Saul,
what are we saying that three were based? The three individuals, Jeroboam, Solomon, David, they were based. The decision was based upon what?
Samuel's statement about how God chooses in what was the text? First Samuel 16:7.
No, but I think Sharika summed it up perfectly, where she said, you know, if here you are, I understand where your heart is at now. There are all these options in front of you. I'm choosing you as you are now. If you stay faithful, then you know we'll walk this road. And if you screw it up, well, then we have a different conversation. It's just like
the understanding is that they are the people when they're chosen, they are faithful at that time.
So it's not about being faithful though, because David wasn't always faithful. The difference.
No. I'm saying at the time.
So their heart at the time of being chosen, their heart postures are all in the same place.
They're all submissive, surrender to the will of God, however you want to put it.
Saul steps out of the covenant and chooses to stay out of it after he's been checked. David steps out of the covenant and chooses to come back with a repentant heart once he's been checked. That's the big difference.
Yeah, it's kind of like, for me, it's kind of like the draft, the sports draft, right? You have people who come together and they pick a guy based on what they believe he can do. And in their mind, he can do the things, or he or she can do the things that they feel like they can do to fit their team. Now, a lot of the times it doesn't work. And then you have the exceptional times where you pick a guy early because he does fulfill what you said and then some. And then you have times where the guy you pick is a total bust, can't work. And then you have the Davids where you have like a Tom Brady where he's picked the 7th round and he exceeds all expectations. But it's all for me. It's based on like what in man's eye, what a man believes another guy can do because they see the potential in him. And God sees what these people can do with him. The question is, are they going to be willing to lend themselves to him to do what he believes they can do? So I go back to the Gideon example, when Gideon was called a warrior of God, when he clearly was not. And he allowed himself to fall in line, and then he became what God said that he would be.
Yeah.
It's a redemption story on a smaller scale, right? So I'm gonna die for all of you, and I know that y'all not gonna choose to stay in covenant with me.
So let's agreeing with Avenue. Let's go to 1 Samuel 16 verse 7, because I guess that's the crux of what Z's question is, and what Samuel reveals about God. Samuel doesn't reveal about God specific to David, but about God, period. Right? And to me, this statement about God is evidenced by his selections. All right? Verse 7, but the Lord said to Samuel, do not consider his height or appearance, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. If that is his posture, you see that in the language that he gives to Jeroboam.
But that's contrary to the language that was used to describe Saul.
No, it wasn't.
Yeah.
Could it be both?
When they talked about Saul, it talked about they talked about his height, and they talked about what was the word they used?
Yes.
Impressive.
Where are you? Where is that at?
Yes.
First Samuel 9 verse.
Saul was impressive. He did look the part, but God doesn't look at that when he makes his choice, is what I'm saying. That's what Samuel is saying. It's just interesting
that Samuel uses something like a description that was contrary to what was mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
Right?
Maybe both.
I don't think it's contradictory. I think he's just saying this is what the people saw. It's not the criteria God used to choose Saul, but the people were just focused on, oh, Saul looks like a rock star.
Yeah.
The other example of this is Peter and Judas. God chose both of them. Right? Both of them stepped out of his will. One decided when he was checked to quote Avanique to come back in, and the other one decided, nah, that's it, I'm good. So God knew how they would end, but it didn't stop him from, he knew what he put in them, he knew what the purpose was, and he's like, where you are now, I'll walk with you. If you step out on my will and I check you, you better come back into that will.
Yeah. So it can't be both? I mean, not like his looks had any concern for God necessarily, but could it be that, okay, the people want somebody that is going to look the part? Right? Not saying that's his primary concern, because sometimes God gives you what you want. Sometimes. But then he's like, okay, these are all the guys that look like what they would pick, but I want somebody who's got the heart that I want them to have. Okay, so this guy has both. He has the looks that they'll accept, and he has the heart that I need him to have.
Then, God didn't choose ugly kings, from what I could tell in the words. Like, they all were attractive.
But we don't know what Jeroboam looked like.
That's true.
Are we sure?
We don't have any description of really what Jeroboam, whether he was short
or the first two apparently were very attractive.
Yeah.
Yeah, but then even Jesus had said
no
comeliness to him, right?
No, Jesus was not attractive at all. Yeah.
So I'm just saying the Bible doesn't really go into God's criteria for choosing Saul. What we do know is when the people asked for a king, God could have chose anybody. Mm-hmm. And God chose Saul. The people didn't choose him. Mm-hmm. And then what we see about how God chose all the subsequent kings, mm-hmm. and what Samuel says about God's process on what he's looking for when he chooses someone to serve or to enlist. like how he chose Abraham. Because God doesn't choose everybody. And there are certain people he says, you know, I want you, and I want you, and I need you, and I'm gonna choose you. But he's looking at the people's hearts when he chooses them. And everybody doesn't walk faithfully. Well, nobody walked faithfully except Jesus. But those who failed had a different posture to David in terms of their response to being corrected.
So I just skimmed through Samuel 9 real quick, and there seems to be a huge difference in the posture of the Saul that's in 9 and the Saul that's grabbing up Samuel because he got rebuked.
Well, verse 10, well, whatever.
I mean, I hear what you're saying, Kendrick, in terms of he did look good, but if you keep going, it talks about like his heart when Samuel was like, hey, you know, the Lord has chosen you. Saul's posture was real humble. He lost that. Like if you go ahead, skip ahead a few chapters, the humility was absolutely gone. When Samuel spoke to him, when he did the sacrifice because he couldn't wait, when Samuel spoke to him, that wasn't the same Saul. It was somebody completely different, to the extent where he grabbed the prophet and ripped his garment.
But so to me, Saul didn't. To me, I felt like Saul didn't even want that because he was like up here, like trying to hide when Saul was, you know, when he was trying to, when Saul was trying to anoint him or whatever. He was really like literally trying to hide, and it's like, okay, like he doesn't even want it. He probably doesn't even understand it. Why are you even putting him there? Like
he was in the corner throwing up like Willie Beeman.
Moses didn't want to go either.
But wait.
Moses, Moses was like, can you please send someone else? Please, can I tap out here? And God got upset with him.
Yeah.
But is that
But he
I don't
stuttered.
want, or is that I don't think I'm good enough?
Correct.
So that's a big difference.
Both.
Yeah. I mean, bottom line is because God has already told him, I know you can do this, and I want you to trust me, not yourself.
So can I ask you?
Moses got help. Like this dude didn't even get the chance. He's like trying to hide, but you're still calling him out. Like, no, you're going. Like
Samuel,
you're not even giving him the help. Like you're like, just go.
Yeah, but
Can I ask
Jonah
a
tapped
question?
out. There's a long list of prophets who decided, God, nah, this ain't for me. And you know, some of them, when they were checked, decided, fine, I'll try to trust God and do this thing. And then others were like, nah, I'm good.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to be a prophet. I know that, man.
Yeah.
So let me ask you a question. So in chapter 10, verse 9, it says, as Saul turned away to leave Samuel, and I guess is this after, you know, you got the whole, I guess he's gone looking for the donkeys, all that stuff. Is that where it's coming after?
yeah.
And it says, as Saul turned to leave Samuel, God changed Saul's heart, and all these signs were fulfilled that day. When they arrived at Gibeah, a procession of prophets met him. The Spirit of God came upon him in power, and he joined in their prophesying. Anyway, what was his heart prior to that? I mean, was this a change? I'm assuming the way this reads is like this is a change from bad, you know, to better.
It's not a change of heart as we think about it in terms of, you know, I'm now a changed man. I'm now living for Jesus. It was just more of a change in disposition from being timid to being a little bit more assertive and confident.
Yeah. That's what I got. He empowered him.
He became a little bit more assertive in his approach. Before he was a little bit more timid, and the change of heart was in that regard. Sorry, Joe has been commenting in the chat. We probably need to pull him in a little bit.
Yeah.
Let's start with Mike. God also told the Israelites that in them choosing to have a king in place, they would regret it. Joe says, predestination is always according to God's foreknowledge. It's because he exists outside of time. I'd pause here and say, infinite possibilities based on your choices, and God knows all of them. And just because he knows which one you would choose it does not, I want to be careful to say it does not mean that you are that you didn't have a choice in where you ended up.
He knows what choice you're gonna make, but it's still your choice to make.
Correct. Or what choice you're likely to make.
Right.
It's like spades. You play the hand out.
Yeah.
You know how it's going to end.
Sharika, who's not on, good point. Okay.
Well done.
He chose Saul because the people look on the outward appearance. He chose David because he looked on the heart, or question mark. Yeah, I'm not sure that the Bible doesn't say, but given how he chose Jeroboam and Moses and other people, even Gideon, I think God's actions are consistent with what Samuel describes of God's actions, and it's a very significant likelihood that he chose Saul by those same criteria. So the God chose Saul to teach the people a lesson.
No. Mm-hmm. No, I don't know.
Samuel makes the same comments.
Why not? It could be.
But then you can say all of the kings to teach them a lesson, because every one of them made their lives a little bit challenging.
I don't think it's so much he chose Saul to teach them a lesson, but whatever the outcome, God will bring a lesson out of it, right? Not all things are good, but he can work all things together for good. So even if what the decision David made, he used that to bring some good out of it.
But he had already told them that if you get a king, you're gonna have a hard. So he had already warned them, like forewarned them. So guess what? This stuff is gonna come to fruition, whether or not you want it. There is a lesson in there, because it's like, I told you that you're gonna be sorry that
right, but it's not like
be sorry that
choosing, I hear you, but it's not like he's choosing people that will fail. He's choosing human beings, and human beings by nature will fail. The only one who didn't.
But I look at it like I do my kids, right? If my daughter, I keep telling my daughter the same thing: don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. And finally, I'm like, go ahead. Like, I'm not saying go ahead like because it's going to end up good. I'm saying go ahead because I know how it's going to end up. And if I know it's going to end up good, I'm not going to tell her to go ahead because it's going to defeat the whole purpose.
So I do say though that in it not working out, Jesus now becomes the king. I mean, he makes it work out through Jesus, right?
Mm-hmm. Had to play out that way.
Yeah.
Well,
right.
No, he didn't have to, but it did. Right?
I would even go as far.
It wasn't going to play out any other way.
No,
right. I mean, they didn't have to choose.
If they didn't want a king, if God kept saying, "You don't want a king, you don't want a king," and then the king was successful,
but that's the thing.
Over and over and over again, it defeats the whole purpose.
Right. But that's the thing, right? There's no way for humans to be completely successful in comparison to what God can do in human form. There's no way. And God knew there's no comparison between him and human. So
Agreed. That's why he let it happen.
He'd be a better king than a human would be. They just chose a way that was going to be a little more reckless.
Yeah, but Kendrick, there were kings that the Bible says, ruled faithfully all the days of their life and all that stuff. So there were good kings who, didn't have, I guess, there was no drama, no scandal during their time. There were kings like that. They weren't perfect, but, they didn't have this baggage.
But they had to die to get
even though they were good kings, though, there was still a side of it that we don't necessarily talk much about. So, like, Solomon taxed the people really heavily.
Yeah.
And his son after him was like, "Yo, you thought my dad taxed you hard? I'm
about the tax."
So I think that there were side effects of having an established king and a kingdom that God was trying to tell them, like, "Yo, I promise you, you don't want this."
Yeah.
And they were like, "Yo, this is what we want." So God was like, "Okay, there's gonna be some L's that come with it."
Mm-hmm.
But I'm going to leave the idea of and restore my authority by putting in place for you a king who is me, and bring it back together. So you get the king that you wanted, but it's still me.
Yeah. Yeah.
Not only is it still me, I get rid of them as I choose. I think that's a big piece of it too.
Oh, I was talking about Jesus, by the way.
I get rid of them as I choose too.
Yeah, just wanted that caveat there.
Yeah.
Joe says, Jared, when it says that God is no respecter of persons, I think this goes along with your point. All these kings made their own choices. God was either pleased or displeased. He gave them all an equal chance. And he comes
God
on to say,
is a respecter of persons, though, but we don't have to go into that.
No, I have to agree with that.
Why do you
very good point.
say that? Why do you say he's a respectable person?
No, Ron, I'm not going to blow your mind in that way. At 9
Oh, it's after 9 o'clock.
Is
No,
that
but
all right?
it's
Hold on. We got 3 minutes. 3 minutes.
It's
Blow
going to be
Ron's mind.
after conversation.
After this is over.
Right.
Yes. All right. We'll hold that thought.
Kenrick, very good point. There's something to that for sure. Why would the word mention Saul's outward appearance? And then specify later that God doesn't go by outward appearance.
But I thought you guys made it. Actually, you made a good point. Is that the difference was that Samuel was describing what God's intentions and God's thoughts, as opposed to when he was describing Saul, it's more like just factual. Like, just like, this is what he was. He was impressive and he was tall.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was a little bit more descriptive when it came to, I guess, descriptive when it came to, the description of Saul as opposed to prescriptive as it came to David.
Can we quickly go to 1 Kings 12? From verse 25, because I think it showed some similarities here that help us to kind of close this thought out. 1 Kings 12. So remember, God is saying, I'm choosing you, Jeroboam, to replace your master Solomon because he's acting the fool, and I'm going to give the kingdom to you if you walk faithfully, right? If you walk faithfully, I'm going to do for you what I did for David. All right?
Mm-hmm.
And truthfully, God said that same thing to Abraham. If you walk faithfully, I'm going to bless all nations through you.
Yeah.
And Abraham, for a while, was on shaky ground. He wasn't really walking that faithfully. And then he passed one test, and God honored his commitment to him, right? Mm-hmm. So let's watch what happens with Jeroboam and watch the similarities between Jeroboam and Saul. Then Jeroboam fortified Shechem in the hill country of Ephraim and lived out there, for he went up and built up Peniel. Jeroboam thought to himself, the kingdom will now likely revert to the house of David. If these people go up to offer sacrifices at the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem, they will again give their allegiance to their Lord Rehoboam, king of Judah. They will kill me and return to King Rehoboam. After seeking advice, the king made 2 golden calves. He said to the people, it is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Here are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt. One he set up in Bethel and the other in Dan. And this thing became a sin. The people came to worship the one at Bethel and went as far as Dan to worship the other. Jeroboam built shrines and high places and anointed priests from all sorts of people, even though they were not Levites. He instituted a festival on the 15th day of the 8th month, like the festival held in Judah, and offered sacrifices on the altar. This he did in Bethel, sacrificing to the calves he made. At Bethel, he also installed priests at the high places he had made. On the 15th day of the 8th month, on the month of his own choosing, he offered sacrifices on the altar he had built at Bethel. So he instituted the festivals for the Israelites and went up to the altar to make offerings. I'll go on to 33. the man of God from Judah comes and he ends up shriveling up his hand and all them kind of things. And the Bible says, even after this, Jeroboam did not change his evil ways, but once more appointed priests from the high places from all sorts of people. Anyone who wanted to become a priest, he consecrated at the high places. This was the sin of the house of Jeroboam that led to its downfall, to its destruction from the face of the earth. 14:7. Go tell Jeroboam, this is what the Lord God of Israel says. I raised you up from among the people and appointed you ruler over my people Israel. I tore the kingdom away from the house of David and gave it to you. But you have not been like my servant David, who kept my commands and followed me with all my heart, doing only what was right in my eyes. You have done more evil than all who lived before you. You have made for yourself other gods, idols of metal. You have aroused my anger and turned your back on me. And there you see the difference between Jeroboam, Saul, and David. And God is recounting David's life as if he was faithful the whole time, almost skipping over his feelings.
Maybe in his judgment, yeah, not saying he's faithful all the time, but his intent was to be, even if he failed, because he's not ignoring. He's just saying that David did. His heart was to do what was required of him to do, and not isolating moments, but going overall as a person, which is what we want to look for in judgment, because no one wants to be judged by their worst day and have that be their
kill for fun.
Right. So and overall, we look at David and we go, yeah, he did some things, but he did some things that were reckless, but he also did some things that were quite in line with what God would have said would be a godly person, and that's what that's what God is looking at.
Yeah, so Jeroboam had a chance to be faithful, and he chose not to be faithful. Saul had a chance to be faithful, and he did not. David made different choices, and so God blessed him differently. But they all started from the same starting line. I would agree with Yolande to a degree that the main difference between Saul, Jeroboam, and David is his repentant posture. I'm not sure if you guys see it. That's the main difference, and I think the book of 1 Samuel paints that very picture. Like when you see Saul's response, he's like, well, Saul was like, well, you were late, first of all, Samuel. And the situation got dire, and I'm the king, right? So I had to make an executive decision and try not to keep the morale of the people, because that's really what was happening. They were encountering this problem. The people were starting to be afraid, and Saul used his authority to try and keep the morale of the people. And we see the same thing with Jeroboam. He saw a situation and was like, yeah, so I need to do something here to make it work.
Yeah, foolishly. Because as we look back at verse 22, that's all he needed, was that foundational piece of going, God is not going to forsake his people because he chose them to bear his name. And that's all he ever needed.
Right.
Just on that.
And neither Saul nor Jeroboam, when it was called to their attention, said, oh man, I messed up.
Right.
Give me another chance. Let me do this thing. I really messed up. Neither of them really said that.
Yeah.
I think one thing that you just said, Jared, that stuck with me was that God speaks with David like he never faulted. And he did that because my understanding is when you come with a heart that is pure for repentance, I throw it away like it never happened. And that's what God said he's going to do. So David's posture reflected, that's been my homie forever. I don't even remember what he was talking about. That ain't it. Like, what y'all talking about? We're not even on that no more. Right. Like, and I think that's the beauty of it. That's a level of forgiveness that we can't understand, but that's it. Like, I don't know what y'all talking about. Right. Like, that's the homie.
Word.
But didn't Saul also, like in chapter 15 say, I've sinned, but please honor me. And he goes on. Does that mean that that apology wasn't sincere to him or something?
Yep.
Well, you can look at it. He didn't really
That's
apologize.
grinding on. Oh, man.
It was like, don't embarrass me in front of the people.
It kind of reminds me of, when people like, I'm sorry you feel that way. That's not an apology. Like, that's not how this works. Like, so don't even look at it like that. That's not an apology.
That is 100% an apology.
No, it's not. No, it's not. It's not. It's basically.
Sorry, got caught. It's different from sorry. Yeah.
Right. Like.
Sorry, you are hurt.
Sorry, I got caught is different from, oh, I'm sorry for what I did.
For what I did.
Right.
And apologize.
Sorry you feel some way about what I did.
Right.
I'm sorry.
It's got nothing to do with me acknowledging the fact that I'm wrong.
Right.
That's the thing.
Yeah, it's more, I'm sorry for you, not for me.
But just, I have sinned. He owned it, though. He was like, I have sinned. No?
He owned it after me.
Let's read it right quick, Z.
But I guess he goes on, like, please honor me before the elders.
Don't embarrass me, homie.
Yeah.
He pulled the Jay-Z on me. Anyway, let me shut up.
Wrong Bible study.
Okay.
Yeah. Yo, Lemonade album is a whole Bible study. Anyway.
Oh my gosh.
Whole Bible study.
Sentence I've never heard in my life.
What?
The Lemonade album is a whole Bible study.
Exegesis on that Lemonade album for us, right?
Pardon?
You need to do some exegesis on that Lemonade album for us and share your enlightenment.
Jerome, I don't know. I'm gonna have to dig into 444 with it. Like that's the New Testament. Lemonade is that Old Testament, and then 444 is that New Testament, right? Like,
yeah. After this conversation, right? After this
exactly.
Right.
Wow.
Where's that, Jared?
All right, I was gonna just add Vanessa's comment right quick. To your point, Jared, it shows great love and patience from God to give something to his children that they beg for, knowing that it would not turn out well. He told them, all you need is me, but here we go to get your kings you wanted so much. Feel it and deal.
With it. Yes,
So-
yeah, more.
There's more to that comment.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, she had more, but
Feel it, deal with it, and at the end, ta-da! You end up with me as your king.
Ta-da.
That's in like 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 57. This victory over this sin is a gift. It's not something that we can do in our own power or our own effort. Like you said, you have to ask for it. And that's what David was probably doing each time. This forgiveness.
Right.
Make me right with you.
Correct. Yeah. And Saul was make me right in front of the people.
Yeah.
Versus dad says David was humble and sincere. He acknowledged his mistakes. This is what God required from his people. Another point is the type of problem they involved in. I do not mean that there are different types of sin, but idolatry is not tolerated by God versus immorality. I would also add that part of the issue was that the people wanted a king and they were rejecting God as king. And God's condition of giving them a king was that the king would be subject to him. And when the king started to act independently, God had to deal with that because then the people would look to the king and not to God. And so he needed a king in there who was faithful to him, so that the people could still look to God. And I think that is also a dynamic that was there. It was I would say it's less about the type of sin and more about the position of the individual and the responsibility that they had. Yeah, because they are shepherding the people. Like I've given you charge over my children. You know, you're not responsible to me for that, and they're looking to you to look to me. So I need you to represent me right, which is what Jerome said was when he made the alignment to Moses. Moses got shafted when he said, "Must we bring water from this rock?" and elevated himself to that status. Nebuchadnezzar got shafted when he said, "Is this not the great Babylon I have built?" And God was like, "But wait, didn't I give that to you? You know what will happen if these people think this was yours and not mine, and I don't do something about this?" You know how the people revere Moses till this day? How more revered Moses would have been if he had made it to the promised land, even after striking the rock. It wouldn't be about God, or about this great Moses that led us, not God who led Moses. And God not sharing his glory with anybody. So that's another point to consider as well. All right, so Z, are you good on this?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. One more comment came in. Acknowledging the problem leads to repentance, but idolatry is to stand in God's position to get the worship reserved to God alone. Exactly. Yes. Idolatry comes in all kinds of forms, though. Like Eve and Adam was idolatry too, you know. So, in fact, I would dare say that almost all sin is idolatry, to be honest.
Explain.
So, to sin, if you define sin in the context of rebellion against God,
You can say that.
where God says to do something and I do something else, then whoever I follow and whatever I do to the error of, to the disregard of what God has said is now my God. Whether it be me or Jerry or Sharika or Beyonce or President Trump, I mean, whoever I choose to follow instead of God is now my God. And I have now made gods before him and now following their ways. So, you know, idolatry is at the root of all of it. It's kind of why I think, no, me personally, God starts with "Thou shalt have no other gods before me." You know, everything else comes from that.
Right. Okay.
This Vanessa Taylor agreed with you. I don't know who she is, but you might want to check.
Oh, that's true though. I like even like that in 1 Samuel when he's talking to Samuel about Saul in verse 11. He's saying he turned his back from following me and had not performed my commandments again. So if he's not following God, who is he following? He was doing his own thing.
And to be fair, particularly idols, you know, the physical ones.
Yeah, but
who's setting the rules of the idols?
That's actually my takeaway. I mean, I know we didn't start takeaways yet, but you know, reading what Jeroboam did, which was the same thing, I guess Aaron did. You make these idols and you say this is who led you out of Egypt. So it's again taking the people's attention away from the one true God and saying, no, this focus on this across here, right? Again, idolatry.
Right. Agreed.
But you're now playing the role of God by dictating and developing the rules.
Correct.
Yeah.
Because the idol is not dictating it, some priest is.
Yeah.
So then the priest is really who the God is, because the idol is not real.
Yeah.
I mean, it doesn't have any mind to think.
No thoughts, yeah.
And so really it's some man standing up as God, which ironically is the imagery of the kingdoms. It's one big man that has raised itself up to be God against God. The idol in Daniel I'm talking about, the imagery of Rome and Babylon and all of those things in one. It's all man. It's mankind. Explain takeaway. Okay. Yeah. So we're about to transition into takeaways. We have these conversations, and because we're following this Bible reading plan, and the reading plan has us in multiple books at one time. Like today, since the last time we met, these are the books that we were reading, and so our conversation has been coming from all of these places. To ensure that we're just not having random conversation that might have been intellectually stimulating. The idea is that we focus on one thing that is impactful to us and be able to articulate it, so that we have ownership of it, so that we can use it going forward. So of all the things that we talked about, what's the one thing that I am walking away with today, that I can use, either to consider or to make change or to reflect on? What am I taking with me as I leave today? And we're going to go around and do a round of that. Jerome went first, and I'm going to ask, if you're following along online, if you can share those in the chat, because as we hear them, we also get to leave with more than just the one that I'm taking away. And we found that it has lasting impact when I can articulate it. So Jerome was in the middle, so it's difficult. I'm gonna go with Kenrick and then come back around to Sharika. So we go that way. Kenrick Avenue.
The last conversation was impactful simply because it reinforced just how I guess patient God is, while also being consistent. Never really thought about it, but also emphasized like the fact that we all have choices. Mm-hmm. And at the end of the day, I mean, it's our choices. It's what we choose that's going to determine our final destination. Where we, are we choosing God consistently and developing that posture that allows us to be more like a David as opposed to Jeroboam and Saul. So that was my takeaway.
Avani?
So I have two. The first one would be to constantly remind myself of the intended audience and the issue that's being addressed when I'm reading, so that I can put it in the proper context. And then also that even if I step out of covenant with God, as long as I'm still alive, I have an opportunity to step back into covenant.
Good. I guess I'll go next. I'm there with you, Avani. Where there's life, there's hope. It was interesting that it said that Saul was king until he died. He never stopped being king as long as he was alive. And like Manasseh, had he made a change, the story could have gone differently. But where there's life, there's hope. Courtney?
All right. I really love our just breakdown again about this idolatry just at the end, and just all of these examples. Really just want to take away from everything that we talked about tonight, just really being obedient and recognizing that, I might be sinning and not even realizing it in my daily, life. So just really trying to be repentant and understand that, who am I following? Am I following God, or am I making my own rules on how I'm living?
Good. Lauren?
Mine was simply a prayer I kept saying as we were talking, just to make sure I have a repentant heart. Like, I don't want to get so comfortable or be on an expert level, feel like I know better than God knows. even about myself. So just don't. I don't want to be so. So I just want to make sure I have a repentant heart and ask God to help me to keep that.
Got you. See?
So mine is similar to what you just said, Lauren, like having the repentant heart, because I'm the type of person. So when I was looking at Saul and he was being so impatient when when Samuel was late. Like, I'm one of those people, you're late, I'm just gonna do it because it's time, And sometimes, unfortunately, you don't even realize that you're putting you first and forgetting everybody else or what God said, and you're worried about what you're doing. And so it kind of resonated with me that he did that, thinking like he was doing God a favor, like really he was doing his own thing. But the big thing that comes out of it is the fact that, hey, had he just gone back to God, is really, really, truly, truly, like sorry for what he did, not to show everybody else, but truly sorry between him and God, and things would have turned out differently. So yeah.
Good. Sharika?
I really don't have a forgiving spirit. Stood out to me. Don't shake your head, Kendrick. I asked you for your personal opinion. Because, like, I don't know, like, it really stuck with me that God really speaks of David like, yo, we could, yo. I don't even remember what you're talking about. And that's huge. And I'm starting to question whether or not he expects that from me, because it's highly unrealistic. So we should probably negotiate that. But I'm happy that it's being extended to me. Because yeah, some things I'd prefer if he doesn't remember. So I found a lot of comfort in that.
Yeah, I think we all agree with that one. There's some things.
Yeah.
Yes, actually that didn't happen, right? Like,
right.
Jeremy, want to go again? Oh, you're good.
No, I'm good.
All right, Ron and Marcelo, you get to close us out, and then
got it. I like the concept. I just like thinking about the thought that God sees the potential in us that we don't see in ourselves yet, and the importance of living up to it daily. So live to the potential, even that we don't see. Always pushing to grow and do better and live better. And I don't mean it in I don't mean it in a shallow type of way, but just to continue to grow in Him. I'll put it that way.
Good.
I want to thank Jerome, Sharika, and Jarrett, because my takeaway is the points that you guys helped me understand. Jerome, primarily because you started this off with the quote that you had about the greatest regret you would have. Not living up to the potential of what God saw on us. That's one of the things that I did struggle with in that reading, and that really helped me to see that it's important for us to believe His report about who we are. It's super important for us to believe that, because that is the only way we want to fulfill everything or anything that He has for us to do. And Jared, your slow walk through the choices of these leaders just really helped us to see that, yeah, God sees the potential in us. He looks at the heart. And it's for us to actually see what He sees. And it's for us to endeavor to see what He sees. Otherwise, we're going to come short. People are telling us all the time what they think of us. And we're telling ourselves what we think. But He's the one telling us. It's kind of like the maker of a car telling you how to use the car. And sitting in the car going, I know how this works. But you've never put hand to plow on the engine, on the pedal, or anything. You don't know how this actually goes. You just understand how it works. But the maker of the car is telling you, oh, what you don't understand about this vehicle is, and you're like, no, I got it. So I really appreciate that. And so I struggled with that this week because I wonder why he would pick a guy like Saul, knowing that Saul would fail. But it wasn't that he knew he would fail. It was that he knew that Saul could do it. Saul just chose not to. Same with Jeroboam. They chose not to. And it comes down to our personal accountability and our personal response to what he's called us to do. So thank you all for that.
Good. Good. All right, so I'm gonna go through the chat. Oren says, last takeaway, last point is real. There's no such thing as a sun god. Somebody made it up. We need to follow the one true God. Joe says, I don't think I'll ever forget what Ron shared about his experience speaking in tongues and his dream regarding his friend. God is real and active. Vanessa adds, David looks like he had more mistakes recorded in the Bible than Saul. It's all about heart posture. One is called a man after God's heart. The other lost his peace of mind and kingdom, even if he was technically king till the end. I'm going to skip over Mike to continue Vanessa's thought. By the time Samuel told him he was getting replaced, he lost because his heart was not one to even repent with time. All right. Mike says, my takeaway is I saw from a post from Kirk Franklin, God does what he does for you based on his grace, not based on your goodness. He does this in spite of our choices.
Kirk Franklin posted in here? We got Kirk? All right.
And Vanessa was responding to you, Ron. She says, mercy, Ron. I never thought about it until recently. He saw me completely differently than how I saw myself. Not differently than how I saw myself. And thank you guys for sharing your takeaways. It's important for us to hear them and to be able to share them with you. All right. Does anybody want to volunteer to pray for us to close?
I'll pray.
All right.
Dear Heavenly Father, we want to thank you for an opportunity to spend time together in your word and spend time together just being able to fellowship. We ask that you would continue to keep us, help us to have a actual restful day on your Sabbath day, and ask for your grace and covering as we head into a new week. Thank you and praise you. In Jesus' name,
Amen. As much as like the debate and the intellectual wrestle and the conversation, the real objective of us doing this format is to encourage people to be able to encourage and equip people to be able to study the Bible on their own, to be able to get perspectives that allow them to make sense of it on their own, to wrestle their own questions, or believe that they can have their thoughts and their understanding and that their own relationship with the Spirit and the Word is meaningful and has merit and can be nurtured and strengthened through dialogue with other people in a form that allows it to be practical to real everyday life, not just ideas in the air, but what does this mean for me every day? And so the format is really just to encourage that. So I hope those of you who are listening inspired through our conversations to either join us in our reading plan or in your own plan to be able to rightly divide the word and get more out of it from your personal daily devotions, and then share in that experience with others, because it's in the sharing that we learn and grow and get new perspectives that allow us to be able to see even more of what God is trying to share. And it builds a kind of camaraderie and oneness in the spirit around the word, so that we have a shared understanding, even if we don't fully agree. We get to a point where we can all agree about where God wants us to go, even if the application varies. So I hope that is something that is still being effected through our conversations, and that is a benefit to all of you, including those who are on the team.
So Vanessa is in the comment section speaking in tongues.
Yeah, I was about to say we need an interpreter right here.
But she has an interpreter.
I don't understand.
She says, "Good night, Dad," and he goes, "Good night, my dear daughter." Like, I'm here. I'm here.
Oh,
There
okay.
you go. There you go. Decency and in order.
The spirit of
You got it.
the spirit.
She got the spirit.
Got a gift of the spirit.
Oui.
Yeah.
Is
the spirit the one that tells you that? So after you interpret, you then glorify yourself and talk about I'm here. Is that how the spirit works?
It didn't give any specifications on bragging rights. Like,
That's all me.
So it was
By the way, that's all me
I had to
interpreting.
make sure that y'all knew there was an interpreter on site.
Yeah.
Right. I understood. She said, "I'm here."
I see.
From the spirit is what Sharika was saying.
That's what
Here
I'm
from the spirit.
Just like your clothes, you're now glowing. So
here.
it must be.
It's like when I speak in patois, we have Lorraine and we have Avanique to translate for you, Kenrick. They are there.
I'm still waiting on what trampling is. So you let me know.
Trampling.
Kenrick, I don't know what it means.
No one knows what it means.
I know Lorraine knows what trampling is.
No.
When she cover her face, she definitely knows.
It's like is stout a word?
You don't even know what that means. What are you talking about?
Yeah, stout is like.
You can't even interpret your own.
Think like the Hawaiian build. No, think like the Hawaiian build, like that stocking.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
That's what it means to be like a trampling, like he's stout.
Yes.
That's what it means.
Muscular, godly.
Yeah, like you know.
We prayed already?
No.
Can we pray? Can we pray again?
All right. Well, it was good of all of you to join us. We are here every first and third Friday at 8 p.m. Until the next time, please drink up.
And happy Mother's Day to all the moms.
Yeah, happy Mother's Day.
Mamas, baby, mamas.
All right.
And the daddies.